Welcome to the story of the most dramatic and pivotal century in the fate of humanity. The 5th century AD was an age when the familiar world was collapsing in every corner of the planet, clearing the way for the birth of new civilizations. In this video, we will tell you how, in a matter of days, once invincible Rome fell, and why the collapse of the empire was only the beginning of a much greater chaos across Europe. We will see how the steppe empire of Attila boldly challenged two superpowers at once. In the Middle East and in India, the mysterious white Huns crushed Persian armies and drained the treasuries of ancient dynasties. We will look in on China, torn apart between north and south, and travel to the opposite edge of the earth, where Maya rulers and the kings of Axum raised great pyramids and shaped the fate of international trade. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what you'd like to hear about next. Enjoy the listen. For the peoples of the Mediterranean, the 5th century AD began with anxious anticipation of an inevitable, catastrophic turning point. By this time, the vast Western Roman Empire had long since lost its old monolithic grandeur. Internal strife and a deep economic crisis were tearing the state apart from within. Tension along the northern frontiers grew with every passing year. The pressure of various tribes kept intensifying, while the Roman legions could no longer guarantee reliable protection. The symbol of this new age of destruction was the Visigothic leader Alaric. For a long time, Alaric tried to win official recognition of his people's status from the Roman authorities, along with land to settle and a regular payment of wages. But Emperor Honorius, sheltering behind the impassable marshes and mighty walls of the city of Ravenna, refused to make any lasting concessions. Honorius repeatedly broke his promises and dragged out the negotiations. Realizing the futility of dialogue with Ravenna, Alaric marched his army straight on the ancient capital. In the year 410, an event took place that shook the entire known world. The Visigoths laid siege to Rome. Terrible famine and devastating epidemics quickly broke the defenders' will. On the 24th of August 410, the city's gates were opened, and Alaric's warriors poured into the streets of the Eternal City. For 3 days they plundered palaces, seized golden ornaments, destroyed works of art, and led hundreds of thousands of inhabitants off into slavery. Rome had not seen an enemy within its walls since the invasion of the Gauls 800 years before. Although Alaric ordered that the Christian churches not be burned, the moral blow to the Roman state proved fatal. The Eternal City lost its aura of invincibility. To its contemporaries, it seemed as though the whole familiar order of the world was collapsing along with its age-old capital. Yet the fall of Rome at the hands of the Visigoths turned out to be only the beginning of even greater upheavals to come. While the empire was still trying to recover from the plunder and the loss of its authority, in the east of Europe, a completely new and dangerous threat was gathering strength. In the steppes north of the Danube, a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes had formed under the leadership of the Huns. By the middle of the 440s, all power over these nomads had been concentrated in the hands of a chieftain named Attila. Contemporaries would soon call him the Scourge of God. Attila stood out for his enormous ambition, his extraordinary willpower, and his gift for uniting scattered tribes. Under his banners gathered not only the Huns themselves, but also numerous Germanic and Sarmatian peoples. Attila built an enormous steppe empire that stretched from the banks of the Rhine to the distant steppes of the Black Sea region. In the first years of his rule, Attila turned to ravaging the Balkan provinces of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine emperors were forced to pay the nomads an enormous annual tribute in gold just to save Constantinople. But Attila's ambitions were not confined to the east. Before long, his gaze turned toward the weakened west. Exploiting a dynastic conflict and laying claim to Roman lands, Attila gathered a vast army and in 451 crossed the Rhine and the Danube. He invaded Roman Gaul, burning and destroying everything in his path. To meet the fearsome Hunnic leader rose the one man capable of raising a force to oppose him, the last great general of the Western Roman Empire, Flavius Aetius. He knew the Huns well, having lived among them for years in his youth as a hostage. He understood their tactics and knew their weaknesses. Aetius managed to forge an extraordinary alliance with Rome's recent enemies, drawing the Visigoths, the Burgundians, and the Franks to his side, all of them united in the face of a shared mortal danger. In the summer of 451, on the broad Catalonian plains, one of the bloodiest battles in world history took place. Tens of thousands of warriors on both sides clashed in a savage engagement that raged on until deep into the night. Both sides suffered colossal losses. The Visigothic king Theodoric I was killed in the fighting, but Aetius managed to hold the line and halt the Huns' advance. Attila was forced to withdraw into his fortified camp of wagons. The brave general had denied the steppe ruler the conquest of Gaul. This retreat marked the first serious defeat of Attila's life. Yet a year later, Attila gathered fresh forces and struck directly at Italy. The Huns ravaged the cities of northern Italy, including Aquileia and Milan. Rome again found itself under threat of total destruction. But epidemics among the warriors, food shortages, and successful diplomatic negotiations, in which Pope Leo I took part, forced Attila to withdraw his troops back across the Danube. A year later, in 453, Attila unexpectedly died during the feasting night of his own wedding. With the death of its charismatic leader, the vast Hunnic power quickly fell apart. Attila's sons launched drawn-out wars against one another, and the subject Germanic tribes rose up and swiftly destroyed what remained of the Hunnic confederation. But even the removal of the Hunnic threat could not save the crumbling Roman Empire. Central authority had completely lost control over the provinces. In 454, out of jealousy, Emperor Valentinian III personally murdered Flavius Aetius, and with that, the empire lost its last talented defender. A year later, the emperor himself was struck down by the followers of the fallen general. The political chaos of the age was slowly seized upon by another Germanic people. The Vandals, led by King Gaiseric, sailed in from North Africa, and in 455 they entered Rome with almost no resistance. Where the Visigoths, 45 years earlier, had shown at least some restraint toward Christian shrines, the Vandals methodically plundered the city for 2 full weeks. They carried off every remaining treasure, stripped the golden roof from the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, and led 1,000 noble Romans off into captivity. From that time on, the very name of the Vandals became a byword for the senseless destruction of cultural treasures. After this sack, the Western Roman Empire effectively became a shadow of its former self. The imperial throne turned into a plaything in the hands of barbarian warlords who appointed and deposed rulers as they saw fit. Real power was concentrated in the hands of the commanders of the mercenary armies. Ravenna remained the nominal capital, but no one obeyed its decrees any longer. The provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Spain broke away for good and began to live lives of their own. The final act of this long drama came in the year 476. The young emperor Romulus Augustulus, barely about 14 years old, held the throne only by the will of his father, the military commander Orestes. The barbarian mercenaries demanded that a third of all the lands of Italy be set aside for their permanent settlement. When they were refused, they rose in revolt. A leader of the barbarian mercenaries named Odoacer seized Ravenna and killed Orestes. But Odoacer did not bother to place yet another puppet ruler on the throne. On the 14th of September 476, Odoacer forced the young Romulus to sign his abdication. The former emperor's life was spared, and he was sent into exile on an estate in southern Italy with an annual allowance granted to him. Odoacer's symbolic act finally drew a line under centuries of history. The commander sent the imperial regalia, the purple robe and the crown, to the Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. Odoacer declared that the West no longer needed an emperor of its own, and asked to be recognized as the ruler of Italy under the supreme sovereignty of the East. And so, in 476, quietly and almost unnoticed, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist, an event that, at the moment of the young man's abdication, seemed like just another military coup, would later become a pivotal milestone in history. The fall of the Western Empire is traditionally regarded as the end of the ancient world and the beginning of a new era in human history, the Middle Ages. The collapse of central authority in Ravenna merely confirmed an order of things that had long since taken shape. On the ruins of the Western Roman Empire, an entirely new political map was forming throughout the 5th century. In place of a single state with rigorous laws and bureaucracy came a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. Various Germanic peoples, who had once served as mercenaries or uninvited guests on Roman soil, now began to build their own state structures and divide up the inheritance of the ancient world. The Visigoths were the first to find a permanent home within the territory of the empire. After their devastating campaigns through Italy and the death of their leader, the Visigoths pushed further west. The Roman authorities were forced to sign a treaty with them and grant them land to settle in Aquitaine, in the southwest of modern-day France. Before long, the Visigoths began pressing actively beyond the Pyrenees. Throughout the 5th century, the Visigothic kingdom steadily expanded its borders across the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigoths subdued the local population and either pushed out or absorbed the other Germanic tribes who had settled there before them. The capital of this kingdom was at first the city of Toulouse, before the centre of power finally shifted into Spain. The Visigothic kings tried to preserve the Roman tax registers and legal norms, building a complex society in which the Germanic military nobility lived side by side with the local Roman aristocracy. A completely different scenario unfolded along the southern shores of the Mediterranean. The Vandal people, led by King Gaiseric, made a dramatic crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar and established themselves in North Africa. By 439, the Vandals had captured the wealthy city of Carthage and made it the capital of their kingdom. The loss of Africa was a mortal blow to Rome, since it was from there that the capital received the bulk of its grain supply. Gaiseric built a powerful navy and turned Carthage into a base for maritime raiding. The Vandals seized full control of the western Mediterranean, capturing Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Unlike the Visigoths, the Vandals harshly persecuted the local Roman population and the followers of Orthodox Christianity, since the Vandals themselves adhered to Arian doctrine. The Vandal kingdom became the most aggressive and isolated of all the new states of Europe. At the very same time, at the northernmost edge of the former Roman world, no less dramatic events were unfolding. Starting in the 440s, the Roman legions withdrew from the island of Britain for good. Left without military protection, the Romanized Celtic Britain population found itself facing constant raids by the northern Pict and Scot tribes. In an attempt to defend their lands, the leaders of the Britons made a fateful mistake. They invited the Germanic tribes of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes over from the continent to serve as mercenaries. The arrangement quickly turned into a tragedy for the local population. The newly arrived Germanic warriors soon recognized the weakness of the local authorities and decided to seize the island for themselves. Throughout the second half of the 5th century, the Angles and Saxons waged a merciless war against the Britons, pushing the native population to the far west of the island, into the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, and even across the sea to the continent, into the region that became known as Brittany. On the conquered lands, the invaders began founding their own small kingdoms. The urban culture of Roman Britain was completely destroyed, and the Latin language gave way to a Germanic tongue. While the old institutions were collapsing on the fringes of Europe, at the heart of the continent, in northern Gaul, the foundation of a new and powerful state was being laid. There the Salian Franks had settled. For a long time the Franks remained a loose confederation of scattered tribes, each obeying its own chieftain. Everything changed with the rise to power of a young and ambitious leader named Clovis I of the Merovingian line. Clovis took command of the Franks in 481 and immediately showed himself to be a cunning politician and a ruthless military commander. In 486, at the Battle of Soissons, Clovis crushed the forces of Syagrius, the last Roman governor in Gaul, who had held on to an independent territory between the rivers Loire and Somme. This victory allowed Clovis to double the territory under his control. The young king then went on to systematically eliminate all his rivals and competitors among the Frankish chieftains, uniting all the tribes under his sole authority. But the most important and far-sighted step Clovis ever took concerned the question of religion. Unlike most other Germanic leaders who converted to Arianism, Clovis chose to be baptized according to Orthodox rite. In 496, in the city of Reims, Clovis, along with his 3,000 warriors, was baptized by Bishop Remigius. This step fundamentally transformed the standing of the Frankish state. Clovis instantly won the full support of the wealthy and influential Gallo-Roman aristocracy and clergy. Every war Clovis waged against his Arian neighbours was now seen by the local population as a war of liberation and righteousness. The adoption of Orthodox Christianity laid a solid foundation for the future integration of the Franks with the local population, and the Frankish kingdom would go on to become the strongest power in Western Europe for centuries to come. A completely different approach to governing conquered lands was on display in Italy at the close of the 5th century. After overthrowing the last Roman emperor, Odoacer ruled Italy for 17 years, but his independence did not sit well with the rulers of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. The Emperor Zeno decided to get rid of Odoacer by using the hands of another barbarian people, sending the Ostrogoths under King Theodoric into Italy. Theodoric had spent his childhood and youth in Constantinople as a noble hostage. He received an excellent education there and knew Roman customs, laws, and institutions inside and out. In 489, Theodoric led his people across the Alps into Italy. The war between the Ostrogoths and Odoacer's forces dragged on for several years. In 493, the two sides made peace and agreed to rule Italy jointly. But during a banquet in Ravenna, Theodoric personally killed Odoacer with his own hands, making himself sole ruler of the country. Theodoric, who went down in history with the epithet the Great, built a unique system of government in Italy. He did not tear down the Roman institutions of power, and the Senate continued to function under his rule. The old tax system and Roman laws were preserved. Theodoric divided responsibilities between the two peoples. The Ostrogoths made up the professional army and were responsible for security, while the Romans handled administration, the courts, and tax collection. Under Theodoric the Great, Italy entered a long-awaited period of peace and economic recovery. His capital was adorned with magnificent palaces and cathedrals. The king actively restored the ruined Roman aqueducts, walls, and roads. Theodoric was a patron of the sciences and the arts, and his court was home to the last great thinkers of antiquity, men such as Boethius and Cassiodorus. The Ostrogothic ruler built an elaborate web of dynastic marriages, giving his daughters and sisters in marriage to the kings of the Visigoths, the Franks, and the Vandals, which allowed him to become the recognized arbiter among all the barbarian rulers of Western Europe. Theodoric proved to his contemporaries that a barbarian kingdom could be a direct and worthy successor to the greatness of the Roman Empire. By the end of the 5th century, then, the map of Western Europe had been utterly transformed. In place of the former Roman provinces, there arose a complex mosaic of new states. The Visigoths had established themselves in Spain, the Vandals held North Africa, the Angles and Saxons were conquering Britain, the Franks were uniting Gaul, and the Ostrogoths were restoring order in Italy. These new states were not simply destroying the old world, but were also laying the foundations for the modern nations and states of Europe. While the western part of the Roman world was rapidly sinking into chaos and splintering into separate barbarian kingdoms, the Eastern Roman Empire managed to hold firm. This state, which modern historians call Byzantium, possessed enormous resources, rich trade routes, and a well-developed system of government. Throughout the 5th century, Byzantium served as a reliable bulwark, shielding the eastern provinces of the ancient civilization from devastating outside blows. The stability and longevity of the Eastern Empire owed much to an unbroken succession of rulers, each of whom contributed to strengthening the state. At the very start of the 5th century, the throne was held by the young Emperor Theodosius II, whose reign lasted 42 years. Although the emperor himself rarely took part personally in military campaigns, his court employed talented administrators. Theodosius II went down in history as the creator of the first official compilation of Roman law since antiquity, known as the Theodosian Code. This document systematized the imperial decrees of the previous 100 years and became the foundation of Byzantine law. It was also under him that the University of Constantinople opened, becoming the leading center of learning and education for the entire Christian East. After the death of Theodosius II in 450, the throne passed to Marcian, an experienced soldier and a level-headed politician. Marcian showed firmness and refused to keep paying the humiliating annual tribute to Attila's Huns. This decision saved the imperial treasury enormous sums and allowed resources to be redirected towards strengthening the army. After Marcian, power passed to Leo I, whose accession to the throne set an important historical precedent. Leo I became the first emperor to be personally crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople. This ritual underscored the sacred nature of imperial power and cemented the bond between the state and the church. Later, in the last quarter of the 5th century, the empire was ruled by Zeno. This emperor managed to contain destructive internal rebellions and displayed the highest degree of diplomatic skill. It was Zeno who succeeded in redirecting the energy of dangerous barbarian leaders beyond his own borders, sending the Ostrogoths under Theodoric off to conquer Italy. In doing so, Zeno spared the Balkan provinces of Byzantium from devastation and preserved the integrity of his state. The main symbol of Byzantium's enduring strength and a key factor in its survival through the 5th century was its capital, Constantinople. The city stood at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, occupying an exceptional strategic position. But the city's growing size demanded a new and reliable system of defense. Under Theodosius II, under the direction of the prefect Anthemius, the famous Theodosian walls were built. This immense fortification consisted of several rows of mighty stone walls, with numerous towers and a deep moat filled with water. The Theodosian walls made Constantinople virtually impregnable to any enemy of the age. Neither the vast Hunnic hordes nor the numerous bands of other nomadic peoples could even hope to storm these fortifications successfully. Constantinople became a safe haven for trade, craft, and government. Yet for the Eastern Roman Empire, the 5th century brought not only outside trials, but also deep internal turmoil. The social life of Byzantium was steeped in religious concerns, and theological disputes about the nature of Jesus Christ spread far beyond the walls of the churches, stirring serious unrest among the population. In 431, at the emperor's initiative, the Third Ecumenical Council was convened in the city of Ephesus. At this council, a fierce struggle broke out against the teachings of Patriarch Nestorius, who held that Christ's human and divine natures existed separately. The council condemned Nestorianism as heresy, affirmed the title of Theotokos for the Virgin Mary, and laid down important foundations of Christian dogma. But the condemned teaching did not disappear. It spread eastward, into Persia and across Asia. 20 years later, religious disagreements flared up again with new force. This time, the cause was the opposite teaching, monophysitism, which dissolved Christ's human nature entirely into the divine. To resolve the conflict, the Fourth Ecumenical Council was convened in 451 in the city of Chalcedon. The Council of Chalcedon adopted a crucial doctrinal definition, according to which Christ was recognized as existing in two natures, divine and human, unconfused and undivided. Despite the decisions reached, the Council of Chalcedon failed to bring the long-awaited peace. Instead, it opened up a deep religious and political rift within the empire itself. The population of Egypt and Syria refused to accept the council's ruling, remaining loyal to monophysitism. This created a lasting tension between the central government in Constantinople and the wealthy eastern provinces, a tension that would persist for centuries. The emperors were forced to constantly balance between rival religious factions in order to hold the country together. Byzantium's foreign policy in the 5th century rested on an intricate mix of military action, financial subsidies, and subtle diplomacy. The court in Constantinople saw itself as the sole legitimate centre of the entire Christian world. Its relations with the emerging barbarian kingdoms of the West were ambiguous. On the one hand, the Byzantine emperors formally recognized the barbarian kings as their own deputies, sending them crowns, consular titles, and marks of honor. On the other hand, Byzantium constantly tried to set the barbarian peoples against one another, to prevent any single neighbor from growing too powerful along its borders. A special place in foreign policy was held by the eastern frontier. To the east, Byzantium bordered the only power equal to it in strength, Sasanian Iran. Throughout the 5th century, despite occasional local conflicts, both states tried to maintain an uneasy peace. The rulers of Byzantium and Persia understood that they both faced a similar threat, the pressure of warlike nomadic tribes from the north. Because of this, the two empires frequently agreed to jointly finance the defense of the Caucasian passes, through which nomads might break through toward the south. Thus, throughout the 5th century, the Eastern Roman Empire displayed remarkable resilience. The combination of Constantinople's impregnable fortifications, a flexible bureaucracy, skilled diplomacy, and military strength allowed Byzantium to survive. While Western Europe sank into an age of barbarian kingdoms, Byzantium preserved the ancient Roman traditions of law, culture, and government, standing as a reliable stronghold of the Christian East. While Europe was living through the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and Byzantium was reinforcing the walls of its capital, in the Middle East and Central Asia, a historical drama of its own, no less immense, was playing out. Here reigned the second superpower of the age, the Sasanian state, or New Persian Kingdom. This was a vast, centralized state, with rich traditions, a developed administration, and an influential Zoroastrian priesthood. Yet in the 5th century, Iran faced the harshest external and internal trials, ones that brought the power to the very brink of catastrophe. The 5th century began relatively calmly for Persia, but in its second half, a series of rulers came to the throne, who each had to grapple with difficult military and religious challenges. Shahanshah Yazdegerd II, who ruled in the middle of the century, sought to strengthen central authority and pursued an aggressive religious policy, actively imposing Zoroastrianism across all the lands under his rule, which led to serious social and religious conflicts. Later, the Persian throne passed to Shahanshah Peroz, whose reign proved to be one of the most tragic in the history of the Sasanian dynasty. Peroz was forced to fight prolonged wars on two fronts, exhausting the state's resources in the process. Finally, at the end of the 5th century, power passed to Shahanshah Kavad I, a flexible and decisive ruler who recognized that the old system of governance and the dominance of the nobility were leading the country toward ruin. Kavad I resolved to carry out bold and radical reforms that fundamentally reshaped Persian society. A special place in Sasanian foreign and domestic policy in the 5th century was occupied by relations with neighboring peoples and with the Christian populations under Persian rule. Traditional rivalry with the Byzantine Empire during this period was largely episodic. In 420 and again in 440, brief military clashes flared up between the two powers. The main causes of these wars were disputes over the protection of religious minorities and control over the strategic passes of the Caucasus. But both empires soon realized that prolonged war would drain their strength, and they chose instead to make peace, agreeing to jointly defend the Caucasian fortresses against nomads from the north. Events in Armenia, which lay under Iranian control, took an even more dramatic turn. In 449, Shahanshah Yazdegerd II issued a decree ordering all Armenian Christians to renounce their faith and adopt Zoroastrianism. This decision provoked a wave of general outrage. The Armenians categorically refused to submit to the demand of the Persian court and rose in a massive popular uprising led by Prince Vardan Mamikonian. The climax of this struggle came at the famous Battle of Avarer, fought in 451. On the field of Avarer, a huge Persian army equipped with war elephants faced off against the Armenian militia. The fighting was extraordinarily fierce and bloody. Prince Vardan Mamikonian and many Armenian nobles fell in battle. The Persians won a formal military victory, but the enormous losses they suffered, combined with the unyielding resolve of the Armenian people, forced the Shahanshah to change course. The Persian authorities were compelled to abandon their forced imposition of Zoroastrianism and restored religious freedom in Armenia, an important step in preserving Armenian identity and culture. But the most terrible and destructive external challenge facing the Sasanian state in the 5th century came from Central Asia. Out of the depths of the Central Asian steppes, a new and powerful adversary advanced upon Iran's borders, a confederation of nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes known as the Hephthalites or White Huns. The Hephthalites built a powerful state in Central Asia that encompassed the territories of modern Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and northern India. They seized full control of key stretches of the Great Silk Road, which brought their rulers enormous financial revenues. Flourishing trade, a strong cavalry, and rigid organization made the Hephthalites the dominant military force in the region. The Persian Shahanshah Peroz resolved to put an end to the threat on his eastern frontier once and for all, and personally led several military campaigns against the White Huns. But the nomads employed a cunning strategy, luring the Persian armies deep into deserts and mountain terrain, setting traps and cutting their supply lines. In the first campaign, Peroz was taken prisoner and was released only after Byzantium helped pay an enormous ransom for him. Failing to learn the hard lesson, Peroz gathered a new grand army and marched against the Hephthalites once more. In the decisive battle, the nomads dug camouflaged trenches and ditches in front of their positions. The heavy Persian cavalry charged forward and plunged straight into these traps. The Persian army was completely destroyed, and Shahanshah Peroz himself died on the field of battle. This catastrophe brought Iran to the edge of collapse. The Hephthalites seized vast eastern provinces of the Sasanian state and imposed an enormous annual tribute on Persia. For several decades, Persia was effectively a vassal of the White Huns, shipping tons of silver to their capital. The crushing military defeat, the loss of eastern lands, and the exhaustion of the treasury triggered a profound social crisis within Persia. Because of the tribute payments, taxes on ordinary people became unbearable, while the great landowning nobility and the Zoroastrian clergy held on to their wealth and privileges, refusing to help the state. Against the backdrop of this crisis, a powerful religious and social movement arose in Iran, led by a preacher named Mazdak. Mazdak's teaching was built on a reinterpretation of Zoroastrianism. Mazdak taught that God had created all earthly goods so that people might share them equally. He spoke out against social inequality, luxury, the nobility, excessive wealth, and violence. The Mazdakites called for redistributing property and land in favor of the poor and the destitute. Mazdak's ideas quickly won over the broad masses of peasants and the urban poor. The young Shahanshah Kavad I, who came to the throne in 488, decided to use the Mazdakite movement for his own political ends. With the help of Mazdak's mass following, Kavad I managed to weaken the influence of the powerful nobility and the Zoroastrian priesthood, who had previously controlled the Shahanshahs and could even remove them from the throne. With the king's backing, the Mazdakites began seizing grain stores and redistributing resources. But this social experiment provoked a conspiracy among the nobility. In 496, the noble conspirators overthrew Kavad I and imprisoned him in a fortress, placing his brother on the throne instead. But Kavad I managed to escape from captivity and flee to the very Hephthalites Persia had recently been at war with. With an army provided by the Hephthalite ruler, Kavad I returned to Ctesiphon and restored his power. Back on the throne at the close of the century, Kavad proved himself a cautious diplomat. He gradually began curbing the more radical actions of the Mazdakites, while preserving the results of his reforms that had weakened the aristocracy. By the end of the 5th century, the Sasanian state had emerged transformed and renewed. Despite the terrible defeats at the hands of the White Huns and the deep social upheavals caused by the Mazdakite movement, Persia managed to preserve its statehood. By weakening the old nobility and restructuring its tax system, Sasanian Iran laid the groundwork for a new flowering that would come in the following century. While the Roman Empire was collapsing in the west of Eurasia and Persia was struggling against nomads in the Middle East, the Celestial Empire was living through one of the most complex and dramatic periods of its history. The 5th century in China falls squarely within what historians call the period of the northern and southern dynasties. The country found itself deeply split into two entirely different cultural and political zones, divided by the natural boundary of the great Yangtze River. Northern China lay under the rule of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who had come from the steppes. These steppe conquerors built their own states, tried to adapt to a settled agricultural civilization, and actively embraced a religion new to them, Buddhism. Buddhism gave the northern rulers the higher legitimacy they needed and helped them unite a diverse population. Southern China, by contrast, remained a stronghold of traditional Han culture. Millions of Chinese families fled south across the Yangtze to escape the steppe raids. In the south, the ancient Confucian traditions endured, and poetry, calligraphy, and philosophy flourished. The southern aristocracy looked down on the northerners, considering them barbarians, even though the southern states themselves suffered from constant political instability and palace coups. The key event in the history of northern China in the 5th century was the rise of the state of Northern Wei. This state was founded by the Xianbei, nomads who had come from the region of Transbaikalia and Manchuria. In 439, the ruler of Northern Wei, Tuoba Tao, completed the long process of uniting all of northern China under his authority. For the first time in a long while, a stable order was established in the north. At first, the Xianbei nobility held on to its steppe customs, its native language, and its military system. But governing millions of Chinese farmers effectively required the nomadic rulers to build a complex bureaucratic apparatus which set off deep internal transformations. The high point of this transformation of northern China came under the reign of Emperor Xiao Wen, who held the throne at the end of the century. Xiao Wen was an outstanding statesman and a passionate admirer of Chinese culture. He understood that without the full integration of the Xianbei and the Chinese, his realm was doomed to fall apart. Emperor Xiao Wen began pursuing a radical policy of Sinicization, the forced and thorough adoption of Chinese customs among the Xianbei nobility. The emperor issued a series of strict decrees. The Xianbei were strictly forbidden to wear their traditional steppe dress. Everyone was required to don Chinese robes instead. The Xianbei language was banned at court entirely. In official administration, all state officials over the age of 30 were required to speak Chinese exclusively. Xiao Wen even ordered that all Xianbei surnames be changed to Chinese form. The imperial house of Tuoba itself changed its surname to Yuan. The emperor also encouraged and promoted intermarriage between the Xianbei military aristocracy and noble Chinese families. The most decisive and symbolic step Xiao Wen took was moving the capital of the state. In 494, the emperor transferred the capital from the northern city of Pingcheng south to the ancient city of Luoyang, which for centuries had stood as the historical and cultural heart of traditional Chinese civilization. To force the steppe nobility to leave their native northern lands, the emperor resorted to a ruse. He announced the start of a grand military campaign to the south, and when the army, exhausted, reached Luoyang in pouring rain, he offered the nobles a choice: continue the punishing march, or stay and turn Luoyang into the new capital. The nobles chose to stay. Buddhism became a crucial pillar of power in Northern Wei. Buddhist teaching preached mercy, explained social inequality through the laws of karma, and drew no distinction between nomads and Chinese. Under the emperor's patronage, Northern Wei in the 5th century embarked on the grand construction of cave monasteries that would become masterpieces of world art. In the first half of the 5th century, not far from the first capital of Pingcheng, the Yungang cave complex was created. Dozens of man-made caves and thousands of statues of Buddha carved into the sandstone cliffs, the grandest of them reaching 17 meters in height and awing the faithful with their majesty. After the capital was moved to Luoyang, the construction of a new, vast cave complex, Longmen, began in 495. On the banks of the Yi River, craftsmen carved temples and sculptures into the limestone cliffs. The Buddhist art of this period reflects the gradual process of Sinicization. While the early statues at Yungang bore distinct Central Asian facial features, the later sculptures at Longmen took on refined, classical Chinese proportions. While northern China, under the Northern Wei dynasty, was living through sweeping reforms and a construction boom, an entirely different picture was unfolding in the south of the country. Southern China, centered on the city of Jiangkan, in what is now Nanjing, was in a state of constant political instability. In 420, the general Liu Yu overthrew the last emperor of the Eastern Jin dynasty and founded a new dynasty, the Liu Song. Liu Yu was a talented military commander who managed for a time to strengthen the borders and carry out several successful campaigns to the north. But the system of power he built proved highly unstable. Throughout the history of the Liu Song dynasty, the court was gripped by an unending, brutal struggle for power. Emperors of the Liu house were marked by a pathological suspicion and cruelty. Princes of the blood and members of the imperial family constantly hatched conspiracies, murdered their own relatives, and stirred up rebellions in the provinces. Extreme inefficiency of governance and destructive internal strife led to the state's rapid decline. In 479, another powerful general, Xiao Daocheng, took advantage of the chaos in the capital, wiped out the members of the ruling Liu Song house, and proclaimed the founding of a new dynasty, the Southern Qi. But the change of ruling house brought the south no lasting stability. The rulers of the Southern Qi dynasty went on behaving much like their predecessors, spending vast sums from the state treasury on luxury, the construction of grand palaces, and personal amusements, all while destroying their own military elite out of fear of coups. Taxes on peasants and artisans kept rising steadily, sparking local uprisings and a general economic decline. Despite the constant political turmoil and bloody coups, southern China in the 5th century remained the greatest centre of science, literature, and philosophy. It was here that the outstanding mathematician and astronomer Zhu Chongzi lived and worked, calculating the value of pi with a precision remarkable for his time. In the south, landscape poetry flourished, monumental historical works were written, and studies of human nature developed. Thus, The 5th century became an age of grand historical experimentation for China. In the north, the nomadic conquerors of the Northern Wei dynasty successfully united the land, carried out deep Sinicization, and laid a solid foundation for the future unification of the empire. In the south, despite the political chaos of the Liu Song and Southern Qi dynasties, the rich cultural heritage of the ancient Han people was preserved and enriched. This synthesis of northern military strength and southern high culture would later become the foundation for the great reunification of China. In the 5th century, South Asia experienced a period that historians rightly call the Golden Age of Indian civilization. Across most of the Indian subcontinent flourished the Gupta Empire, a powerful state whose rulers succeeded in uniting vast territories, granting their subjects decades of peace, security, and great economic prosperity. The first half of the 5th century unfolded under the long and peaceful reign of a ruler named Kumaragupta I. He ascended the throne in 415 and ruled the empire for nearly 40 years. Kumaragupta I skillfully preserved the legacy of his great forebears, maintained internal order, and developed international trade. During this period, Indian merchants actively traded with the countries of the Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, and China. It was during the reign of Kumaragupta I that the empire reached the height of its cultural flowering, a time of great achievements in literature, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. At the Gupta court worked the outstanding poet and playwright Kalidasa, whose works became the pinnacle of classical Sanskrit literature. Society saw the active development of both Hinduism and Buddhism, which coexisted in an atmosphere of religious tolerance and mutual respect. The cultural policy of the Gupta rulers was marked by a commitment to supporting enlightenment and learning. The highest expression of this commitment was the founding of Nalanda University in the first half of the 5th century. Kumaragupta I himself ordered the construction of this vast monastic and educational complex. Nalanda quickly became the largest center of learning and Buddhist thought in all of Eurasia. Thousands of students and pilgrims traveled there to study from every corner of the world, from China, Korea, Tibet, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. The complex included hundreds of lecture halls, several great libraries, temples, and living quarters for teachers and students alike. At Nalanda, scholars studied not only the religious texts of Buddhism and Hinduism, but also gained deep knowledge of logic, Sanskrit grammar, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics. The university was sustained by the generous donations of emperors and the revenues of hundreds of nearby villages. Nalanda became a true symbol of India's intellectual greatness, remaining the leading center of learning for centuries to come. But this peaceful, carefree existence of the Gupta Empire lasted only until the middle of the 5th century. In the 440s and 450s, a mortal danger loomed over India's northern borders. From the regions of Central Asia through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, warlike nomadic tribes began pressing in. The first to strike the lands of northern India were the Kidarites, followed by a wave of even more dangerous invaders, the White Huns, known in Indian sources as the Huna. These were the very same Hephthalites who, at the same time, were dealing devastating blows to the Sasanian Persian state. The nomads were renowned for their extraordinary ferocity, superb cavalry organization, and mastery of siege warfare. The aging emperor Kumaragupta I sent his younger son Skandagupta to defend the northwestern frontier. The young prince displayed an outstanding gift for command and personal courage. In a series of grueling battles, Skandagupta managed to crush the nomad bands entirely and drive them out beyond the country's borders. In 455, immediately after his father's death, Skandagupta formally ascended the imperial throne. The first years of his reign were consumed by constant defense of the state. Understanding that the enemy had not yet spilled its last drop of blood, Skandagupta strengthened the border fortresses and formed new military units. Before long, the Hun tribes launched another massive invasion of India. The battle between Skandagupta's forces and the vast cavalry of the White Huns became a decisive moment in the country's history. Indian chronicles and rock inscriptions record that Skandagupta showed tremendous personal bravery, taking part in hand-to-hand combat himself. In the end, the Indian forces won a complete victory once again, and the invaders were driven back across the Indus River. Skandagupta's victory over the Huns carried enormous significance for the whole of Asia. Where the nomadic invasions in Europe and Persia had led to the fall of states and the destruction of cities, India, under Skandagupta's leadership, managed to defend its independence and spare its cities from ruin. But the price of this great victory proved ruinously high for the Gupta Empire. Years of war against a dangerous enemy had completely drained the state treasury. Maintaining a huge army required constant, colossal spending, while the trade routes in the northwest lay cut off and shattered for a long time. To keep paying his soldiers and officials, Skandagupta was forced to resort to extreme financial measures. In the final years of his reign, the purity of the gold in imperial coins dropped sharply, and coins increasingly began to be struck in silver and cheap alloys instead. This led to currency devaluation and an economic crisis in the provinces. After Skandagupta's death in 467, the Gupta Empire entered a period of inevitable decline. A succession of rulers followed on the throne, none possessing either Skandagupta's military talent or Kumaragupta I's authority. Within the imperial family, drawn-out dynastic feuds and struggles for the throne broke out. Various branches of the dynasty contested the right to rule, weakening the central government at the capital, Pataliputra. Taking advantage of the emperor's weakness, the rulers of distant provinces, vassal princes and governors, began gradually breaking away from the centre, refusing to pay taxes and forming their own independent lines of succession. By the end of the 5th century, the Gupta Empire had effectively lost its former unity and cohesion. Central authority controlled little more than the Ganges Valley, while the outlying regions lived lives of their own. During this period, the Hun tribes once again began gathering their strength along the borders, preparing for a new, decisive strike against a weakened India. Thus, the 5th century became, for India, an age of great contrasts. The first half of the century gave the world an extraordinary flowering of culture, literature, and learning, symbolized by Nalanda University. The second half of the century showed the tremendous military resilience of the Indian people under Skandagupta's leadership, but the enormous price paid to repel the nomadic invasion undermined the economic foundations of the state and set in motion the gradual disintegration of the great Gupta Empire. In the 5th century, processes were unfolding across East Asia that would shape the political map of the region for a long time to come. While China was consumed by the fierce struggle between its northern and southern dynasties, the neighbouring regions, the Korean Peninsula, the Japanese archipelago, and the steppes of Mongolia, were living through a period of vigorous state building, cultural contact, and large-scale military conflict. On the Korean Peninsula, the 5th century marked a decisive stage in the history of the Three Kingdoms period. 3 independent kingdoms fought for power and influence over these lands: Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Shilla in the southeast. Each of these states had its own army, its own culture, and its own political ambitions. The dominant force on the peninsula during this period was the northern kingdom of Goguryeo. Its greatest flowering and economic might are tied to the name of its outstanding ruler, King Gwanggaeto the Great, who came to the throne at the very end of the 4th century and ruled until 412. Gwanggaeto was a gifted commander and an energetic statesman. Over the course of his reign, he carried out dozens of successful military campaigns. Gwanggaeto the Great significantly expanded his kingdom's borders in the north, crushing the Shenbei tribes and seizing vast territories in Manchuria. In the south, his forces inflicted a crushing defeat on the neighbouring kingdom of Baekje, reducing it to a vassal state. When the kingdom of Silla and Japanese forces tried to resist Goguryeo rise, Gwanggaeto personally led a vast army to the very southern tip of the peninsula and utterly crushed the allied forces. Gwanggaeto the Great's son and successor, King Jiangsu, carried on his father's confident policies for most of the 5th century. In 427, Jiangsu took a crucial step, moving Goguryeo capital from the northern fortress of Hwando south to the city of Pyongyang. This decision signaled Goguryeo intent to dominate the entire Korean peninsula outright. In 475, Jiangsu's forces captured Baekje's capital, killed its ruler, and annexed the rich valley of the Han River. Goguryeo had become a true East Asian empire, one that both the Chinese dynasties and the nomadic steppe peoples were forced to reckon with. Parallel to the events on the Korean peninsula, no less profound processes were unfolding on the Japanese archipelago. In the 5th century, Japan was living through the height of the historical period known as Kofun, a name derived from the massive earthen burial mounds built as tombs for rulers and the highest nobility. The central political process of this era was the gradual unification of scattered tribal confederations under a single centre. That centre was the state of Yamato, located in the fertile Kinki region in what are today the prefectures of Nara and Osaka. The rulers of Yamato, known as Okimi or Great Kings, managed to subdue the local chieftains and establish a rigid hierarchical system of government. A symbol of the enormous power and resources of the Yamato rulers was the construction of the giant keyhole-shaped Kofun burial mounds. The most famous and majestic monument of this era is the Daisen Kofun in the city of Sakai, associated with the name of Emperor Nintoku, who reigned in the 5th century. In its sheer scale and the labour invested in it, this immense structure rivals the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Building such mounds required the efforts of tens of thousands of labourers over many years, testament to the extraordinarily high level of centralised power achieved in Yamato. 5th century Japan was not isolated from the world. The rulers of Yamato maintained close diplomatic and military ties with the states of the Korean peninsula, especially Baekje and Gaya. From Korea, a steady stream of craftsmen, blacksmiths, weavers, and literate officials arrived on the Japanese islands, bringing with them advanced technologies for working iron, producing pottery, and writing. The rulers of Yamato also actively sent embassies to the Liu Song and southern Qi dynasties in southern China, eagerly seeking official recognition of their ruler as the supreme military authority over all of Japan and southern Korea. 5th century Chinese chronicles recorded the so-called 5 kings of Wa, the rulers of Yamato, who regularly sent tribute to the southern emperors. To the north of China and Korea, across the endless steppes of Central Asia and Mongolia, another formidable power held sway in the 5th century, the Rouran Khaganate, a mighty nomadic empire formed by a confederation of various steppe tribes. The Roran were the first nomads in history whose ruler officially adopted the supreme title of Khagan, meaning Khan of Khans. The Roran Khaganate stretched from the shores of Lake Baikal to the Gobi Desert, and from the foothills of the Altai Mountains to the borders of Manchuria. They controlled the northern stretches of the Great Silk Road, drawing enormous revenues from trade and lawful tolls levied on merchant caravans. Throughout the 5th century, the Roran Khaganate waged relentless, fierce warfare against the state of Northern Wei. The rulers of Northern Wei viewed the Roran as the chief threat to their northern frontier. Emperor Torbar Tao and his successors repeatedly launched grand military campaigns deep into the steppe, trying to crush the Khaganate and protect their agricultural lands. The clashes between the Xianbei of Northern Wei and the Roran were fought without compromise. Huge masses of cavalry collided across the steppe. Both sides burned pastures and drove off hundreds of thousands of head of livestock. To protect their lands from the constant Roran raids, the rulers of Northern Wei began strengthening and rebuilding sections of the Great Northern Walls and building a network of powerful military garrisons along the frontier. Despite these relentless blows from China, the Roran Khaganate held onto its power and influence throughout the entire 5th century. The Roran maintained diplomatic relations with the southern Chinese dynasties, trying to act against Northern Wei in alliance with the south. Under the rule of the Roran Khagans, the steppe remained a vital link connecting East Asia with the peoples of Central Asia. Thus, the 5th century in East Asia became an era of intensive state-building and consolidation. On the Korean peninsula, the kingdom of Goguryeo under Gwanggaeto the Great and Jiangsu reached the height of its historical power. On the Japanese islands, the Yamato clan united the country and immortalized its power in the grand Kofun burial mounds. And across the steppes of Central Asia, the Roran Khaganate held its status as the leading nomadic power, holding back the expansion of the northern Chinese dynasties. All of these processes laid the foundation for the further development of East Asian civilization. While the Eurasian continent was living through the fall of empires, a great migration of peoples, and religious transformation, on other continents of the earth, entirely distinct civilizations were flourishing in their own right. The 5th century AD was a time of deep cultural connections, architectural triumphs, and a global flowering for the peoples of Mesoamerica, the Horn of Africa, and Southeast Asia. In the New World, on the territory of the modern Western Hemisphere, the 5th century marks the highest flowering of the classic period of Maya civilization. Yet the development of the low-lying tropical regions of Central America unfolded under the powerful outside influence of another grand center of power, the great metropolis of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico. Teotihuacan was the largest city in the New World, with a population of over 100,000 people. It possessed a powerful army, a developed trade network, and monumental architecture on a grand scale, including the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. Teotihuacan's influence extended for 1,000 kilometers around it. At the end of the 4th century and throughout the 5th, Teotihuacan carried out a direct political and military intervention into the region of the Maya city-states. A pivotal moment of this era was the establishment of a Teotihuacan-linked dynasty at Tikal, one of the most powerful of the Maya cities. In the year 378, a Teotihuacan military commander named Siaj Kak arrived at Tikal, deposed the previous ruler, and placed a new king on the throne. In the 5th century, the grandsons and successors of these rulers consolidated the new order. King Yaxnun Ahin I and his son Siaj Chan Kawil II blended the local Maya traditions of Tikal's art and culture with the monumental style of Teotihuacan. In the visual art of the period, on the stelae and pottery of 5th century Tikal, images began appearing in large numbers of warriors clad in Teotihuacan-style armor, carrying spear throwers and wearing distinctive headdresses. Similar processes unfolded in other major Maya centers. In 426, the ruler Kinich Yaxcuc-Mo, who likewise had close ties for Teotihuacan and Tikal, founded a new dynasty in the city of Copan, in what is now Honduras. Copan became a crucial southern stronghold of Maya culture, the site of grand construction of pyramids, ball courts, and a unique hieroglyphic staircase. Thanks to this integration and trade, the 5th century became a true golden age for dozens of Maya city-states, among them Tikal, Copan, Calakmul, Palenque, and Huachactun. In the tropical forests of Guatemala, Mexico, and Honduras, the sciences flourished. Maya priests perfected an extraordinarily complex long-count calendar system, developed a sophisticated hieroglyphic script, and advanced astronomy and mathematics. For the first time in the history of the New World, using the concept of zero, Maya architects raised stepped pyramid temples that towered over the green canopy of the jungle, while farmers built elaborate systems of terraces and canals to feed a growing urban population. Far from the jungles of Central America, on the eastern edge of the African continent, another mighty center of world civilization thrived in the 5th century, the kingdom of Aksum. This state occupied the territory of modern Ethiopia and Eritrea, holding an exceptional geographic position at the crossroads of the most important trade routes linking the Roman Empire, Persia, India, and southern Arabia. Having adopted Christianity back in the 4th century, Aksum reached the peak of its commercial, political, and military power in the 5th. The capital, the city of Aksum, astonished visitors with its enormous stone palaces and its grand monolithic stelae, obelisks carved from single blocks of granite. These stelae marked the burial sites of Aksumite kings and symbolized the permanence of their power. The main source of Aksum's wealth was international trade by sea and by land. The Aksumite port of Adulis on the Red Sea became the greatest trading hub of the region, through which flowed precious goods, gold, ivory, incense, monkeys, emeralds, and silk. The kings of Aksum minted their own gold, silver, and bronze coinage, bearing Christian symbols and inscriptions in both Greek and the Ge'ez language, evidence of just how deeply Aksum was integrated into the world economy of the time. The kingdom of Aksum commanded a powerful fleet and a disciplined army. Throughout the 5th century, Aksum held complete control over shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. It successfully extended its political influence across to the opposite shore into southern Arabia, subjugating the local Himyarite kingdom to its will. Aksum served as a reliable ally of the Byzantine Empire in the south, defending Christian trading interests against the encroachments of Persia. At the same time, in Southeast Asia, across what is today Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, the ancient state of Funan was living through its own highest period of flowering in the 5th century. Situated on the delta of the Mekong River, Funan was a crucial maritime crossroads of the Great Silk Road. Funan's rulers actively absorbed Indian culture, religion, and systems of government. In 5th century Funan, both Hinduism and Buddhism took root. Sanskrit was used at the royal court, and state institutions were modelled on Indian examples. The trading port of Okyo grew into a wealthy international hub, where archaeologists still find Roman imperial gold coins, Persian gems, Indian jewellery, and Chinese mirrors from the 5th century. Funan set the course for the future development of the entire Khmer civilization. Thus, the 5th century AD was a time of truly global history. While in Europe, the familiar order of antiquity was collapsing and barbarian kingdoms were being born, and in Asia, empires struggled against the onslaught of nomads. On other continents, the greatest pyramids of the Maya were being built, the stone obelisks of Axum were being raised, and the trading ports of Southeast Asia were flourishing. The 5th century was not merely a time of decline or the end of the ancient world. It was an age of humanity's great reformatting. The old world was giving way to a new historical reality, one in which the foundations of the medieval civilizations of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas were being laid.